Hi, I'm Marie Price, a geographer who studies immigration, and I'm the president of the American Geographical Society. Human mobility is influenced by physical proximity, as the vast majority of human movements are short distances. Yet human mobility regularly defies physical proximity, resulting in long, complex routes to distant locations or situations where people are trapped between states or detained on remote islands. As part of the project, let's explore how immigration is reshaping our understanding of proximity. Immigrants and the transnational linkages they form are also creating new geographies, such cyber social networks that reshape our understanding of belonging, community, and practices of livelihood increasingly rely on virtual proximity. It is this tension between physical proximity and virtual proximity, the desire for corporeal closeness and the advantages of digital flexibility that drives many aspects of social life in the 21st century. This diagram of population flows shows that many immigrants stay within their region, the large, thicker bands of orange or purple showing movements within Asia, Europe. But then the circle lines show some of the larger interregional migrations of greater distance. We'll look at another diagram like this later on. According to the United Nations, there are roughly 300 million immigrants living in countries other than their country of birth, a large number to be sure. Yet it represents only 3.6% of the world's population, which is not such a large number. In 1980, before the current era of globalization began, there were only 100 million immigrants, and they represented 2.3% of the migrant stock. So the number and percentage of cross-border movements are increasing. And as this graph shows, every regional grouping has seen significant increases between 1990 and 2020. Relatively small number of people who move across international borders to reside in some country other than their country of birth can profoundly remake our geographies and build connectography. Every region of the world produces immigrants and receives immigrants. This figure shows the number of immigrants by country. Nations compete for high-skilled workers and also build walls to keep people out. Immigrants form dense networks between locations that facilitate movement, ease integration, and send vital resources back to their places of origin. Who is able to move and where is shaped by country of origin, age, gender, economic resources, human capital, or skill. We are in a world where the aspirations to emigrate far exceed the capabilities to do so. Or as geographer Jorgen Carling termed it, there are millions of people on the planet experiencing involuntary immobility. So proximity, be it physical, digital, or network-driven, is changing the patterns of immigration and how immigrants form transnational linkages into cyber-social geographies. It is worth remembering that in the mid-20th century, after 2 world wars, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was declared. For our purposes, Article 13 states that everyone has a right to leave any country, including his own, and to return to his country. Human mobility is a universal human right, but the Declaration does not ensure individual access to a state of one's choosing. And in the map, you can see a wide range in the percentage of immigrants that make up the total population in a country. For many, it is less than 1% of the total population, and for a few states in dark blue, the total is over 34%. Geographers have made connections between human mobility and proximity since the late 19th century. Ravenstein's Laws of Migration, which were first published in 1885 and then expanded upon a few years later, made the distinction between near and distant very important in understanding immigration, as well as the types of places that produced migrants. He observed through careful mapping using the latest censuses that were becoming available in different countries and different units or scales of geography to understand where people were moving to and how these concentrations were affecting places. Many of the movements at that time, people were leaving rural areas because most people lived in rural areas. And as he said, traveling long distances to the centers of commerce. But it's worth noting, even in this map of Canada and the US, or part of Canada and the US, how many states in 1880, the number of immigrants were 30 or 40% of the total population in a particular state. Two proximity concepts that I'm going to focus on are connectography, discussed by Parag Khanna, and cyber social geography, presented by John Kelly. And I think they're very useful in understanding immigration today. So let's think about connectography. There are large migrant corridors that exist and that they help create these diverse geographies. Some of them are shown here on this table from UN data, and many of them reflect flows between neighboring states, such as Mexico and the United States, or Russia and Ukraine, or Ukraine and Russia. By the way, this is 2021 data, before the current conflict was happening. But there are also places that are more distant, say the US or India, or India and the UAE. And so migration corridors with several million people moving through them exist in proximate space, but also in quite distant networks. And how do they form and why? Here's one example of connectography. It's a map of a visa that the US gives to highly skilled workers called the H-1B visa. And this visa you must be college educated and sponsored by an employer to get a visa to work temporarily in the United States, or the status may be adjusted later. Here, the biggest arrows are one from India, with by far the largest numbers of H-1B holders in the time period mapped. But then Canada and the US, and Mexico are 2 and 3. And then there's arrows of people being recruited from a wide range of countries. So this one visa policy creates linkages from really diverse countries and places near and far. The next example of merging connectography comes from looking at where international students to the US come from. And here you see a wide range. These are the top 25 sending countries from 2016, 2017. By far the largest sender was China at 350,000, and next India at 186,000. And then other important senders, including our neighbors, Canada and Mexico. This too, you can imagine, creates a connectography of international students connecting back with their countries of origin and perhaps establishing new and different lives in the United States. And finally, returning to this style of graphic, looking at regional migration flows. And one thing that's important about this graphic is that the arrows and lines are scaled to the size of the flow. For example, Latin America, most of the movement in 2022 is within Latin America, but there are important flows to North America. You can see too, most regions experience mostly migrants from their own regions. The exception, you see North America has a diversity of regions flowing in, as does Europe, and so does West Asia, which is particularly the Gulf states of the Middle East. The other interesting thing about this diagram, it compares female to male migration. So again, if you look at West Asia, which again would be the Gulf states, you'll see that male migration is much bigger than female migration. And so there are important gender differences that a graph like this captures. The main theme is that these regions can be big in their linkages within the regions, And the vast majority of flows tend to be regional, but there are also really important interregional flows happening. Next, I want to turn to cyber social geography. I think the networks that are mediated by telecommunications, whether it's WhatsApp or Skype, internet streaming, all the different social media worlds and that immigrants create and maintain to stay connected are a very important part of the immigration story. There was an article earlier this year in the Washington Post about a Quechua-speaking Bolivian immigrant who set up a broadcast station in her garage and tells stories in Quechua about her life in the United States and has this really broad following, mostly from Bolivia, but in other parts of the world too, where there's a Bolivian diaspora. This kind of human connection was unimaginable 20 years ago, and yet seems totally normalized today. The most profound impact of these cyber social worlds is the movement of money, especially remittances that migrants earn in one country and typically send to their country of origin. So this World Bank data speaks to the scale of these flows. It's estimated that about $800 billion are moved around each year through remittances. India is the top recipient of remittances. Of course, India as a country doesn't receive it. It's the migrants themselves who receive these funds, or their families. Then Mexico and China and Philippines and all these countries produce pretty significant outflows of immigrants. But equally interesting are the second graph that shows how much remittances represent of GDP. And in Tonga, a Pacific island nation, not too far from Samoa, the figures are 50% in Tonga. And the countries in this list are from Central Asia, Central America, South Asia, the Caribbean, and even the Middle East, speak to developing countries that have migration as a vital mobile livelihood system. People leave so they can send money back to their families. And to just put a geographic point on this, Tonga is quite a remote place. You have to go very far to land in some place where you would be able to work and send money. A lot of Tongans go to New Zealand and Australia, but in other destinations in the Pacific and the Americas as well. I've studied remittances in previous research in Latin America, specifically Bolivia. And while there's huge economic advantages to doing it, there are definitely economic and social costs. Towns and villages that people leave, usually it's working age adults, often become demographically skewed, very young people and very old people with that core middle not there. The physical infrastructure may improve, and certainly there's all sorts of ways of communicating using cellular digital technology. But the challenges of maintaining those intimate connections and especially keeping families together are real. Nevertheless, remittances are a huge part of the cyber social world that connects people through immigration. Here are the data comparing low and middle income countries. And it's quite striking, even during the pandemic, when a lot of normal work life stopped, the numbers of immigrants, the flows of remittances did not decline that much, which speaks to their resilience. Finally, a focus on immigration has to also look at how connections and networks can abruptly end. So this book by Sonia Shah that came out in 2020, The Next Great Migration, discusses the likelihood of immigration increasing and yet the challenges of being able to be mobile also becoming more difficult. Think back to the beginning of COVID-19 pandemic as human circulation came to a dramatic stop. Countries closed their borders, or the dramatic surge in wall building along national borders seen all over the world. Finally, as a nation states focus on securitized borders to control migration, stop smuggling, manage post-conflict security, or fight terrorism, new forms of cyber social surveillance that rely upon facial recognition, drones, sensors, telemetry are deployed to manage discrete areas of interest. Here, proximity becomes a source of fear. I'm conducting research right now in the lower Rio Grande Valley to understand the interface between mobility and immobility in this highly securitized river valley. Here, state power and state practices have physical expressions in the landscape, whether border control, checkpoints, or the border wall, as you can see in the distance in the photo with the agricultural fields. In fact, borders are being remade, shifted, even maybe outsourced to other countries. And this idea of proximity is something that has to be managed, challenged, and reshaped is a really important part of the immigration and securitized landscape work that I'm doing. This is a map generated by one of my students, Claire Cantrell, and it shows how in the lower Rio Grande Valley, particularly from Brownsville to Rio Grande City, over the last 15 years, a lot of wall has been built. It's a challenging environment because the boundary is actually a river. And yet the wall actually is often inland several miles from the river, because that's the only place that you can build a wall on a levee. Otherwise, it would be flooded out. And this landscape change has all kinds of challenges to understanding both the future of immigration and the challenges of proximity, particularly in this border region. When doing research there last January, we began working with an organization called Team Brownsville that receives asylum seekers who have been let in by Customs and Border Patrol and are processed. So this is one small immigrant center in one small town on the Texas border. And the range of countries in which they've served in a period of a year is quite astounding. Mexico, Central America, Venezuela, Colombia, Ecuador are well represented, but so is China, and well as many countries from South Asia, including Afghanistan, Iran, India, and Russia, Ukraine. So in this changing dynamics of trying to serve, trying to seek asylum, where proximity and remoteness come into conflict with each other all the time, it makes one think of why these particular routes and how these individuals ended up in this small Texas town. Through securitization and border enforcement, these are efforts that disconnect people on opposite sides of boundaries, and these efforts are growing. As the complex paths people must take to seek asylum in a web of virtual and physical institutions, along with a vast network of smugglers making money off of this uncertainty, this unstabilizes my understanding of proximity. These examples show how migrants seek to physically connect with people and places through mobility. Yet that same human mobility is often challenged. We know that virtual proximity allows for livelihood strategies across borders and great distances. Exciting and meaningful cyber social communities exist. At the same time, millions of people vote with their feet for a chance at physical proximity with people they love, or for an opportunity for a life with less fear. In terms of immigration, the intimacy of physical proximity cannot be ignored. So I end with a photo of the Rio Grande River Valley, a border, a watershed, a shared community. that is a focus of intense securitization. Here, the connectography is breaking down, but the cyber social geographies of surveillance and other virtual linkages are growing. Thank you.